us. So God is going to bring them into this wonderful boot camp called the desert, Mount Sinai. And it's a 3-month journey down to Mount Sinai where they will be down there for a year. And next week we'll look at what they did down there for the whole year, and how they received the priesthood and the tabernacle and the law. And so God is going to lead them now. And it says in verse 21, the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire. So God is leading them by day, He's leading them by night. Now I think this is interesting in chapter 14. I find it interesting. It says in fact, my wife's the one that pointed this out. We were talking about Scripture the other night, and she said, isn't this funny? Verse 5, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people, and they said, what is this we have done by letting these people go, Israel go? What have we done? And then down in verses 10 through 11, it says in verse 11, they said to Moses, the people said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? And so you have Pharaoh on one hand saying, what have we done by letting them go? And the people, what have you done by bringing us out here? It's like everyone's confused. What's going on? Moses said to the people in verse 13, fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will work for you today. Verse 14, the Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be still. So what are they going to learn out here? 3 months down to Sinai. What are they going to learn? What was the first question we brought up in the Bible? Do you trust God? These folks are going to go through a royal boot camp. And they are going to learn the ways of the Lord. They've lost their story. They're going to learn their story, and they're going to learn to trust in God. Then we move on in chapter 14 to verse 21. We know that the children of Israel left the Passover. They had unleavened bread, which speaks of how quickly they had to move out. They roasted the lamb, not boiled it like the Egyptians, but roasted it, ate it, ready to go, made their way out, and they escaped. And Pharaoh regretted it, sent his armies after them. And I imagine now he is very mad, and he's coming after them. And here now we see a repetition. For Moses in chapter 14 and verse 21 stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back. Remember Charlton Heston? He raises his hands, and what happens to the sea? The sea opens up. The sea opens up. And then Israel passes on dry land. And when they finally have passed on dry land, Moses raises his hands in verse 26, stretched out his hand over the sea, and the water came back upon the Egyptians. It returned to its wanton flow when the morning appeared, and the Egyptians fled into it, and the Lord routed the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. Now, this is also explained in chapter 15, verse 19. Let me read that one. For when the horses of Pharaoh with his chariots and his horsemen went into the sea, the Lord brought back the waters of the sea upon them, but the people of Israel walked on dry ground in the midst of the sea. That should bring back a memory. When the horses of Pharaoh with his chariots and horsemen went into the sea, the Lord brought back the waters of the sea upon them, but the people of Israel walked on dry ground in the midst of the sea. What does this remind you of? Noah. This is a replay. It's a recreation. It's a new creation. It's a new beginning for the people of God. I think that by the time we're done, particularly with the Old Testament study, you're going to come to one conclusion, and that is that God is very patient. He is very, very patient with His people. And we see here a new creation, a new beginning. But we also see something else that is interesting. Why do you think God chose to deal with the Egyptians this way? I would propose that God chose to deal with the Egyptians in the Red Sea this way because if you look back at Exodus chapter 1 and verse 22, we see that Pharaoh commanded all his people every son